Do you ever wonder, why do I feel so anxious all the time? Why am I so anxious? I feel like I'm constantly riddled with anxiety. Well, the Bible actually, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus actually taught the reason you're so anxious is because you don't pray. Prayer is an act of trusting God. That's what it is. It's asking, like, there's so many things in our society and in our lives and on just everything that goes on around us. There's so many of them that are beyond our control, outside of our ability to grasp. That, I mean, whether that's global economic issues, political stuff, just your own physical body. It's interesting how little control we even have over that. We can take precautions to try and prevent the spread of a disease and then get it anyway. It's very fascinating that, in fact, as I was kind of like, as the crow fly, watching this stuff happen, it seemed like the people that were the most afraid of it were the ones that were getting it the most. The people that kind of exhibited the least amount of fear or anxiety over the thing seemed to be doing just fine. So it's something to consider. Like, but why am I so anxious? Maybe that's your alert. Light comes on the dashboard. It's time for you to pray. Because of the fact that it's a confession. What prayer is, it's a confession. I'm limited, and it's a confession that God is unlimited. It's a confession that I don't have the strength. God has the strength. I don't have the resources. God has the resources. And so it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get anything from God other than God himself. And that in itself is a valuable resource. So, if you're not a believer and you ask the question, why are you so anxious? You should be anxious. That there are things to be anxious about, none the least of which is eternally, right? Hell and heaven are in the balance, and that you're on the wrong side of it. There's things to be anxious about. And the fact that at least a Christian has the opportunity to ask God for his resources and for himself and for his power and for his comfort. A Christian has that. Christians also have access to community with other believers in which we can give comfort which we have received to one another, holding each other accountable towards belief in God and towards the spiritual disciplines that are so helpful and useful in staving off things like discomfort and anxiety and frustration. So, like, Christians have a lot to pull from and to rest in and to rely on regarding these matters, but the unbeliever has none of it. Maybe you can build a community around other non-believers or believers in other things. Sure, fine, whatever. The thing is, they're just as anxious and have just as few answers as you do. They don't have anything better to offer. And at best, you end up circle jerking each other in your anxiety. That's one of the reasons why water cooler talk so often at work is complaining. Without anything else to do, you end up in negative spirals like that. You don't have a choice because you don't have anywhere positive to go, positive to pull from. So naturally, you end up just complaining and complaining and complaining and complaining, and that you just spiral deeper into the abyss of exactly the same problems that you're experiencing. So, what's wrong? I'd say first, y'all need Jesus. Y'all need Jesus. Jesus is so much of a comfort for every situation. It cannot be underestimated. And that y'all need the church. The church is such a resource for comfort in every situation. You're going through a divorce, you just went through a divorce, you're going to get married, your marriage is going through a hard time, Marriage is going through a great time. You just had kids, you're wanting kids, you just had a miscarriage. Doesn't matter what situation there is. The church is willing, ready, and able to bring healing into that situation in a way you just can't get from the secular world. So maybe you're anxious because you need to be anxious because you're a lost person. You don't have Christ. Maybe you're anxious if beyond that because it's true. It's an accurate assessment of the society with inflation out of control, with disease running rampant, with a fragile economy. There are things to be concerned about. Being aware of that is not necessarily wrong, but you also need to bring those things to the throne of Christ. That's, I think, the reason why we're so aware of these things. But also, I want to highlight one of the reasons we're probably all anxious is the fact that we're doing everything wrong. The way we keep track of days and nights, just time itself, it's wrong. All of human history, people rose with the sun and went to bed with the sun. And maybe they didn't have iPhones, but maybe they were better off without them. And one of the fascinating things when you look at that they set their times and seasons based on the stars and the movement of the celestial bodies instead of just what their iPhone tells them what time it is. I didn't see, like, when you read their accounts, yes, there was anxiety because there was actual things to be anxious about, like being devoured by a wild animal or succumbing to death from various diseases that they couldn't control, and wars and kingdoms that were constantly going at conflict with one another. And yet you also see a lot of beautiful poetry and peace, and that we find out that actually they were very sophisticated. They weren't simple-minded at all, in such that they were unwise, but they were very simple. They led very simple lives. They worked hard. They cooperated with one another. They took care of one another in communities in a way that our society is lost. So maybe if we made some changes along that line, regulated our sleep schedules better, regulated our diets a little better, regulated our relationships a little better, we'd be less anxious. Those are things that you can practically do whether you're a believer or not. But there's just a little bit of extra, a little bit of nos, I think, in the trunk of the believer as far as getting past these things, that comes from being in a community of believers, having regular daily routines of scripture and prayer, and just taking these things to God himself and letting him handle his own business on behalf, because he loves us and wants good things for us, and especially wants himself for us.